Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little heavier. But don't worry, we're going to take it slow. Find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights a bit, let your shoulders relax. And before we drift too far into the past, I want you to do what I always find oddly comforting. Just take a second and notice where you are right now. What time is it where you are? What place in the world are you listening from? Somewhere quiet, I hope. Somewhere soft. Because tonight, we're not following kings at their banquets or generals on their horses. We're following the people who lost, the prisoners, the ones who survived the battle, and then had to deal with everything that came after. And, as it turns out, that part was often worse. So let's just gently step into it. No rushing, no drama. Just the slow, uncomfortable reality of what happened when the fighting stopped. And the silence began. Because the first thing to understand about prisoners of war is that there was no single fate. There was no standard outcome, no neat rulebook. Instead, there was a wide, unpredictable range of possibilities, and most of them were not great. Imagine for a moment that the battle has just ended. The noise is fading, the shouting is gone. The dust is settling into a soft, powdery quiet. You're still alive. Which, at this point, already puts you ahead of quite a few people. But you're surrounded, your weapon is gone. And someone, usually not in a particularly good mood, is telling you to stand still. And this is where things begin to branch. Depending on where you are, and who captured you, your life might continue in different directions. Let's start with the most efficient option, execution. Now, this wasn't always personal. In fact, it was often very practical. Armies in the ancient world didn't have the infrastructure for long-term prisoner care. There were no proper camps, no supply chains, and feeding prisoners meant taking food away from your own soldiers, which, as you can imagine, was not a popular policy. So sometimes the decision was simple. If the prisoners couldn't be used, they were removed, quietly, quickly. No paperwork, no appeals, just a very final solution to a logistical problem. And while that sounds harsh, it was often seen as normal, not cruel, not shocking, just how things were done. But not everyone was executed. Oh no, because sometimes prisoners were far more valuable alive. Let's drift over to the concept of ransom. This was popular in medieval Europe, where nobles captured other nobles for money. It was one of the more civilized aspects of warfare. If you had gold tucked away, your capture might actually be survivable. You'd be held in relatively decent conditions. Sometimes in a castle, sometimes with servants. You might even dine with your captor, because you were worth more alive than dead. Killing you would be like burning a bag of money. Of course, this system worked best for the upper classes. If you were a common soldier, things were less luxurious. Because no one was coming to ransom you. No wealthy uncle. No royal treasury. Just you and your bad luck. And this brings us to another common fate, enslavement. Now this wasn't always labeled that way. But the reality was simple. You were captured. And then you were made to work. Hard. Fields. Mines, construction. Wars didn't just destroy armies, they disrupted economies. They emptied villages, they left farms unattended. So prisoners became those hands. It was efficient, it was profitable. And it meant you didn't have to kill them. It wasn't a dramatic existence, no heroic speeches. Just a slow, grinding routine. Day after day, forever. But let's not stay in one place too long. Because history likes variety. Sometimes, prisoners were kept for something symbolic. Humiliation. You might be paraded through a city, chained, exhausted, while crowds watched, some curious, some indifferent. And so your suffering became a message. A quiet, uncomfortable lesson for everyone else. Don't end up like this. And then, sometimes you simply disappeared. No records. No clear outcome, just another name lost. Ordinary people who didn't leave behind stories. who didn't have chroniclers following their lives, who were just gone. Being a prisoner of war wasn't a single experience. It was a spectrum, from comfortable captivity to sudden endings. So take a slow breath, and let's drift a little deeper. Because the story isn't just about what happened after the battle. It was about what people believed about enemies, and about what a human life was worth, and that answer changed a lot. Alright, we're still drifting. The night is quiet, the battlefield is far behind us now, and you are still not going home. Because being captured was never really the end of anything. It was more like the start of a very long, very uncertain second chapter. So let's float gently into a world that loved rules, at least on paper. Ancient empires. Now, empires like to think of themselves as organized, civilized, structured, which is a polite way of saying they had systems for everything, including what to do with you. Let's begin with the Romans, because of course we are. They show up everywhere, slightly overconfident, extremely organized, and very proud of both qualities. Now, if you were captured by Rome, your fate depended heavily on one key question. Are you useful? Not morally useful. Not emotionally valuable. Just practically useful. If the answer was yes, you were now part of the Roman economy, which sounds better than it was. Because Rome had a massive appetite for labor. Fields needed tending. Roads needed building. Mines needed, well, mining. And Rome, in its efficient way, looked at prisoners as a renewable workforce. So prisoners were sorted. The strong ones went to heavy labor. The skilled ones might end up in workshops or households. And if you were very unlucky, well, you might find yourself in a place designed not for productivity, but for entertainment. Yes, the arena. Now, not every prisoner became a gladiator. Despite what movies might suggest, it wasn't all dramatic duels. But some did end up there, trained, fed, prepared, and then eventually displayed. Because Rome had a very particular way of turning human suffering into public spectacle. It was normal, expected, a way to remind people who was in charge. Power doesn't just want to win. It wants to be seen winning. Now, if we slowly move eastward, we find other empires doing similar things. Take the Persian Empire, for example. The Persians had a reputation for being relatively tolerant rulers. They didn't always destroy what they conquered. They often absorbed it. Instead, they could be relocated, moved from one part of the empire to another, resettled, put to work in new communities. It wasn't freedom, but it was stability. You might lose your home, your language, your world, but you might still have a life. Now let's drift a little further into ancient Greece. Greece, philosophy, art, and also a very practical approach to prisoners. Athens often leaned toward using prisoners as labor. Sparta, on the other hand, well, Sparta had a significantly more intense vibe. When it came to prisoners, they weren't always seen as assets. Sometimes they were seen as threats, potential future enemies. Different cultures, different priorities, different outcomes for the same unfortunate situation. Now, as we keep drifting through time, something interesting happens. People start thinking about prisoners, not just using them. Ideas of honor begin to creep in, particularly among the upper classes, knights, nobles, warriors with titles. If you captured someone of equal status, you treated them properly. You respected their rank. You waited for the ransom to arrive. But if you weren't noble, none of these rules applied at all. This creates a strange dual reality. One prisoner is writing letters, eating decent meals, while another is, well, not. Status mattered more than survival itself. Sometimes it came down to individuals, the captor, their personality, their beliefs, their mood that day. You might be captured by someone who sees you as a human being, who offers water, who allows rest. As the centuries move on and wars become larger, more industrial, the question of prisoners becomes harder to ignore. Suddenly, old methods, execution, enslavement, ransom, start to feel insufficient. It's simply too many people. Too many bodies. Something that will eventually become prisoner camps. But for now, we're still in that in-between space, where old habits linger. So take another slow breath and let's keep drifting. The story is about to become a little more familiar and a little more unsettling. Alright, we're still here, still drifting. Still somewhere between the quiet of the battlefield and the long shadow of what comes after. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. For most of history, being a prisoner of war was improvised, messy, deeply dependent on luck, status, and the personality of whoever happened to be in charge. But as we gently move forward in time, something shifts. War itself begins to change. It becomes larger, more coordinated, less about small groups clashing, and more about entire nations leaning into each other like slow-moving storms. And when wars grow, so do the number of prisoners, which creates a problem. Not a moral one, at least not at first. A practical one. Because suddenly, you're not dealing with a handful of captives. You're dealing with thousands. And thousands of people are difficult to manage casually. You can't just keep them in a castle basement. You can't quietly deal with them without consequences. And you definitely can't feed them indefinitely without planning. So naturally, systems begin to appear. Not kind systems. Not fair systems, but systems. Let's ease into the early modern period. Somewhere between the fading echoes of medieval knights and the rising hum of gunpowder warfare. Armies are now more structured, more professional. Which means, at least in theory, there are rules. Now whether those rules were followed is another story. But they existed, and that alone is a change. Because for the first time, there's a growing idea that prisoners are not just things to be used or removed. They are part of the process. An expected outcome of war, which sounds very clinical. And it is. So what happens to you now? Well, instead of immediate decisions on the battlefield, you are moved, marched, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, away from the front lines, towards somewhere more controlled. And this is where we begin to see the early versions of what we would recognize today as prisoner camps. Now, camp might sound a bit too organized. At first, these were often just enclosed spaces, fields with guards, converted buildings, anything that could hold a large number of people in one place. The goal wasn't comfort, it was containment. And that difference matters. Because once you're contained, your life becomes very repetitive. Wake up, wait, eat if there's food. Sleep if you can, repeat. Days blend together. Time becomes softer on the edges. And this is something we don't always think about when we imagine prisoners of war. Not the dramatic moments, but the long stretches of nothing, the waiting, the not knowing, because no one is telling you what happens next. There's no timeline, no clear endpoint, just existence in a space that isn't yours, with people who aren't your friends, guarded by people who don't particularly care about your comfort. Now, to be fair, some attempts were made to regulate this. There were agreements, early treaties, promises between nations about how prisoners should be treated, and on paper, they often sounded quite reasonable. Food should be provided, basic needs should be met. Prisoners should not be unnecessarily harmed. Very sensible. Very civilized. But then, reality happened. And reality, as usual, was inconsistent. Because rules only work if people follow them. And during war, people tend to focus more on winning than on maintaining standards. So conditions varied wildly. In some places, prisoners were relatively well cared for, given enough food to survive. Shelter from the worst weather. Not comfortable, but manageable. In others, things slipped. Supplies ran low. Guards became less attentive, or more hostile. And the line between prisoner and burden began to blur again, which, historically speaking, is never a great sign. Now let's gently move toward a period where everything becomes bigger, more intense, more industrial. The kind of wars where entire continents seem to hold their breath at the same time. Yes, we're drifting into the era of large-scale global conflict, and with it, a scale of captivity that earlier centuries simply couldn't imagine. Because now, instead of thousands, we're talking about millions of prisoners, captured across vast battlefronts, moved across countries, held in camps that stretch as far as the eye can see. And suddenly, the idea of managing prisoners becomes an enormous challenge, not just logistically, but morally. Because when numbers get that large, individual stories start to disappear. You're no longer a person who is captured. You're part of a group, a statistic, a number on a list somewhere. And this is where things become quietly unsettling. Because systems that handle large numbers tend to simplify, they reduce, they focus on efficiency. Which means your individuality, your name, your past, your small personal details becomes less important. Not intentionally cruel, just irrelevant to the system, and that can feel strangely cold. Now, before we drift too far into that, let's pause for a moment, because even in these large systems, small human moments still existed. A guard who looked the other way, a shared piece of bread, a conversation across a language barrier that somehow still worked. These moments didn't change the system, but they existed within it, quiet, unrecorded most of the time. And they remind us that even in structured, impersonal environments, people were still people, trying to get through the day. Now, as we continue, we'll start to see how these massive systems evolved, how rules became more formal, how the world began slowly, unevenly to agree that maybe, just maybe, there should be limits to what happens to someone after they've already lost. It's not a fast process. History rarely is, but it's there, in the background, like a quiet idea that keeps returning, no matter how many times it's ignored. So stay with me, keep your breathing slow, and let's move a little further forward, into a world that tried sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to make captivity a little less uncertain. All right, we're still drifting, still moving slowly through time, where things are becoming a little more familiar, and somehow a little more unsettling at the same time, because now we've reached the moment where humanity does something very human. It tries to fix things, not perfectly, not consistently, but it tries. And in the case of prisoners of war, that attempt comes in the form of rules, written ones, agreed upon at least in theory by multiple nations sitting around tables, trying to decide how badly people should be allowed to treat each other after the fighting stops, which is an interesting conversation to imagine. Polite voices, carefully chosen words, and somewhere underneath it all, the quiet understanding that these rules will be tested very soon. So let's ease into one of the most important ideas to emerge from this period. The concept that a captured soldier is no longer an enemy in the same way. They are no longer a threat. Which means, again, in theory, they should no longer be treated as one simple idea. Surprisingly difficult to implement, because war has a way of lingering, even after the weapons are lowered. But still, the idea grows, and it begins to take shape in agreements that slowly become more formal, more detailed, more specific. Food must be provided, shelter must be given, prisoners must not be harmed unnecessarily. And again, it sounds reasonable, almost obvious, but historically, this was a shift. A quiet, significant one. Because for the first time, there's an attempt to create a shared expectation. A baseline. Not kindness, exactly, but restraint. Which, in the context of war, is already a big step. Now, as these ideas develop, something else begins to happen. Prisoner camps become more defined, more structured. Not just places where people are kept, but systems with routines, schedules, processes. And this is where life as a prisoner becomes strangely predictable. Not easy, not pleasant, but predictable. You wake up at a certain time, you're counted, always counted. Because numbers matter now. You receive food, whatever is available. Sometimes enough, sometimes not quite. You might be assigned work, light labor, maintenance, tasks that keep the camp running, or sometimes no work at all, which sounds like a relief until you realize what replaces it. Time. Endless, unstructured, stretching time. And that can be its own kind of difficulty. Because when there's nothing to do, your mind starts to wander, back to home, to people you haven't seen, to questions that don't have answers yet. Is the war over? Do they know I'm alive? How long will this last? And the most uncomfortable one of all, will I ever leave? Now to help with this, prisoners often created their own routines, small ones, ways to make the days feel separate. Some wrote letters that might or might not be delivered. Some played games, simple ones, anything to give shape to the hours. Some even organized classes, teaching each other skills, languages, little pockets of learning, inside a place that was otherwise defined by waiting. Which is quietly impressive if you think about it, because even in captivity, people looked for ways to feel human, to hold on to something that belonged to them. Now, of course, not all camps were the same. Some followed the rules more closely, others drifted away from them, because again, rules only matter if they're respected, and during large conflicts, that respect could vary a lot. In some places, conditions were manageable, hard, yes, but survivable. In others, things became strained. Supplies ran short, overcrowding became an issue, and slowly, quietly, standards began to slip, not always dramatically, sometimes just a little. A slightly smaller ration, a delay in medical care, small changes that added up over time. And this is something history often shows us. It's not always sudden, obvious cruelty that causes suffering. Sometimes it's gradual neglect, the slow erosion of what was supposed to be guaranteed. Now, let's gently widen the lens for a moment. Because prisoners weren't just sitting in camps, waiting for the war to end. They were also part of something larger. Exchange, yes. Prisoner exchanges, another attempt at balance. If both sides have prisoners, they can trade, return people to their homes, which sounds hopeful. And sometimes it was. Families reunited. Soldiers stepping back into a life they thought they'd lost. But even this system was not perfect. Negotiations could be slow, complicated, and not everyone was considered equal in these exchanges. Rank still mattered. Health mattered. Sometimes, convenience mattered most of all. So while some people went home, others stayed, waiting for a deal that might, or might not, ever include them. And so once again, we return to that familiar theme, uncertainty, even in a system designed to reduce it. It never fully disappears. Now, as we continue drifting forward, we're approaching a time when these systems, these rules, will be tested on a scale that no one quite anticipated. A scale that stretches them, bends them, and in some cases, breaks them entirely. Because when conflict becomes truly global, when entire nations are involved, the question of how to treat prisoners becomes unavoidable. And the answers, well, they're not always consistent, not always comforting, but they are important. So stay with me, keep your thoughts slow, and let's move gently into that next chapter, where the idea of rules in war meets the reality of just how hard those rules can be to keep. All right, we're still here, still moving slowly, still letting the story unfold at its own quiet pace. And now we arrive at a point where everything becomes larger than expected. Not louder, not more dramatic, just bigger. Because as we drift into the era of global wars, the kind that pull in entire continents, the number of prisoners begins to rise. Not hundreds, not even thousands, but millions. And when numbers reach that scale, something subtle happens. Individual stories begin to blur, not because they don't matter, but because the system handling them can't keep up with the detail. So instead of names, there are lists. Instead of faces, there are counts. And instead of personal histories, there are categories. Which is efficient, but also a little unsettling. Because it means that your very human experience is now part of something much less personal. Now at this point in history, there are already rules in place. Agreements between nations about how prisoners should be treated. Expectations. But when the scale increases, those expectations are tested in ways that no one fully planned for. Because it's one thing to say, every prisoner should be fed. It's another thing entirely to feed. Hundreds of thousands of them, every day, through disrupted supply lines, across vast distances, while your own population is also struggling. And this is where reality begins to press in on those carefully written rules, not always through deliberate cruelty, sometimes through simple strain. Resources become thin, food is rationed, medical supplies are limited, and slowly, quietly, conditions in many camps begin to change, not overnight, but gradually. A little less food, a little less care, a little more crowding. Over time, those small changes add up. Now let's stay with the feeling of the camp for a moment, because by this point, camps have become entire worlds of their own. Self-contained, with their own rhythms, their own unspoken rules. Thousands of people, all waiting for something they cannot control. And within these spaces, people adapt. Because that's what people do. They find ways to make environments slightly more manageable. You start to recognize faces. You form small groups, friendships even. Quiet alliances built on shared experience. Someone always knows how to fix something. Someone else knows how to cook whatever is available in a way that makes it almost enjoyable. And these small skills become valuable because they make the days a little easier. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of life in these camps is how people dealt with time. Because time behaves differently. It stretches. A single day can feel long, slow, almost heavy, but then weeks pass. And you're not entirely sure where they went. And without clear milestones, without events to mark the passage, everything begins to blend together. Which is why routines become so important. They give structure to something that would otherwise feel endless. Wake up, count, eat, work maybe, wait, sleep, repeat. It's not exciting. In fact, it's the opposite of exciting. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Because this quiet repetition becomes the reality of captivity. But the slow, steady passage of days. Now, let's gently shift our focus for a moment. Because not all prisoners experience the same conditions. Even within the same system, there were differences. Some camps were relatively better managed. Others struggled. And some fell far below the standards that had been agreed upon. Again, not always out of direct intent, but sometimes simply because the system was overwhelmed. Too many people, not enough resources. And when that imbalance grows, conditions can deteriorate quickly. Now there's another layer to this as well. Communication, or rather, the lack of it. Because for many prisoners, contact with the outside world was limited. Letters might be allowed, but they took weeks or months to arrive. If they arrived at all, and each letter carried a kind of quiet weight, a connection to a life that felt increasingly distant, a reminder that somewhere, beyond the fences, families were still living their lives, seasons were still changing, and you were still here, waiting. Now, despite all of this, there were also efforts, both official and unofficial, to improve conditions. Organizations formed, groups that tried to monitor treatment, deliver supplies, to ensure that standards were being met. And sometimes, they succeeded, not perfectly, but enough to make a difference. And those small improvements could mean a lot. Even just the knowledge that someone, somewhere was paying attention, that the situation wasn't entirely invisible. Now, we're approaching a point where the idea of prisoners of war becomes even more complicated. Because not all captivity follows the same patterns. Not all systems hold together under pressure, and not all rules survive contact with reality. Some are stretched, some are ignored, and some are quietly set aside altogether. Which brings us to a more difficult part of the story. Not dramatic, not loud, but quietly heavy, because when systems fail, the experience of being a prisoner can change very quickly. But we'll approach that gently, slowly, the same way we've approached everything else tonight. No sudden turns. Just a steady, honest drift through what happened, and what it meant to enter a different kind of waiting. Alright, we're still drifting. Still moving at that slow, steady pace where nothing feels rushed, and everything unfolds a little at a time. And now we've reached a part of the story that is a bit heavier. Not louder, not dramatic. Just heavier in a quiet way. Because this is where the systems we talked about, the rules, the agreements, the careful ideas about how prisoners should be treated start to bend. And sometimes they break. Not always all at once. Often it happens gradually. A small exception here. A delayed shipment there. A decision made under pressure that quietly sets a new precedent. And before long, the structure that once felt stable begins to feel uncertain again. Now, this doesn't happen everywhere. It's important to remember that. Some places continue to follow the rules. Some camps remain relatively stable. But others begin to drift away from those standards. And the reasons are not always simple. Sometimes it's shortage, food running low, medical supplies stretched thin. Sometimes it's distance. Camps far from oversight where fewer people are watching and fewer questions are being asked. And sometimes it's something less tangible, fatigue. Because war, especially long wars, has a way of wearing people down. Not just soldiers, but everyone involved. Guards, officials, entire systems. And when that fatigue sets in, the energy required to maintain standards begins to fade. To follow rules carefully begins to fade. Not with a loud decision, just quietly. Now, from the perspective of a prisoner, this shift can feel subtle at first. A slightly smaller meal. A longer wait for basic care. A tone in a guard's voice that feels a little less patient. And you notice it. Maybe not immediately, but over time. Because when your entire world is contained within a single place, small changes become very noticeable. Now let's slow down even further here. Because this part of the story is not about sudden events. It's about gradual change. The kind that creeps in without announcing itself. And one of the most difficult aspects of this is uncertainty. Because when conditions begin to shift, you don't always know if it's temporary, if things will improve again, or if this is the new normal. And that question can sit quietly in the background of every day. Now, even in these situations, people still adapt. They always do. Routines adjust. Expectations shift. What once felt difficult becomes familiar, which is a strange thing to think about. But it's true. Humans have an incredible ability to adapt even to environments that are far from ideal. Now let's gently touch on something else that becomes more noticeable during this period. Differences between groups of prisoners. Because even within the same war, treatment can vary depending on who you are, where you're from, what role you had before capture. And this adds another layer of complexity. Because now it's not just about being a prisoner. It's about being a specific kind of prisoner, and that can influence everything. Access to resources, living conditions, even how closely the rules are followed in your case. Which brings us back once again to that familiar theme that history rarely treats everyone equally. Now, despite all of this, there are still moments, small ones, where the original ideas of fairness of restraint still appear. A guard who follows the rules carefully. An official who insists on maintaining standards even when it's difficult. These moments don't always change the overall situation, but they exist. And for the people experiencing them, they matter. Now as we continue moving forward, we begin to approach the end of conflict. Because wars, no matter how long they last, eventually stop. The fighting ends. Agreements are signed. And suddenly a new question appears. What happens to the prisoners now? And at first glance, the answer seems simple. They go home. But as we've seen so many times already, history rarely chooses the simple answer. Because going home is not always immediate. Not always straightforward, and not always possible in the way people imagined. There are processes, logistics, lists to check, transport to arrange. And after years of conflict, even these steps can take time, a lot of time. So even after the war is officially over, the waiting continues, in some cases for months, in others even longer. And during this period, life in captivity enters a strange in-between state. The war is over, but you're still not free. You know you'll leave eventually, but you don't know when. And that uncertainty returns, familiar, quiet, lingering in the background. Now when release finally does come, it's often subdued. Not a dramatic moment, not a sudden rush of emotion. Just a process. Names called, groups organized. Movement back towards something that used to feel normal. And as we'll see in the next part, that return to normal is not always as simple as it sounds. Because time has passed. People have changed. The world itself has moved on. And stepping back into it can feel just as uncertain as everything that came before. So stay with me, keep that slow rhythm, because we're about to leave the camps behind and follow the prisoners into what comes next. Alright, we're still here. Still moving slowly. But now something is changing. The fences are still there, the routines still exist, but in the distance. Quietly, almost uncertainly, the idea of leaving has become real. The war is over, not in theory, not in rumor, but actually over, and yet, you're still waiting. Because the end of war does not instantly become the end of captivity. There are lists to organize, records to verify, transport to arrange across countries that are still recovering from everything that just happened. And so, the waiting continues. But it feels different now. Before, the waiting was heavy, uncertain. Now, it's lighter, still slow, still frustrating. But with a direction. You know something is coming, eventually, and then one day. Your name is called. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just part of a process, a list being read, and suddenly, you're moving, gathering what little you have, standing in line, walking out of a place that for a long time felt like the entire world. And as you leave, there's no grand moment, no music, no speeches, just a quiet step forward, and then another, and just like that, you're no longer a prisoner, at least officially. Now begins the journey back, and this part is often imagined as simple, a straight line from captivity back to home. But in reality, it's rarely that neat, because home may not be exactly as you remember it. Time has passed, years in some cases, and during that time, life continued, families changed, communities shifted. Some people moved away, some are no longer there at all, and you have changed too, which makes the idea of returning feel a little more complicated. Now the journey itself can take time. Long train rides, ships crossing quiet stretches of water, groups of former prisoners moving together, not quite soldiers anymore, not quite civilians yet, just something in between. And during this journey, there's a strange mix of emotions, relief, certainly. You're leaving captivity behind, but also uncertainty. Because you're heading towards something that no longer feels entirely familiar. And that can be quietly unsettling. Now when you finally arrive, there's often a moment, a pause where everything feels both recognizable and slightly distant at the same time. The streets look the same. The buildings are where they should be, but something feels different. And it takes time to understand why. Because the change isn't just around you, it's within you as well. Life in captivity leaves marks. Not always visible, not always easy to describe, but they're there. In the way you think about time, in how you respond to uncertainty, in the small habits you picked up that no longer quite fit in this new old world. And adjusting takes time. Now, for some, this transition is gradual. They settle back into routines, reconnect with family, find work, rebuild a sense of normal. And over time, the experience of captivity becomes something distant, still present, but not overwhelming for others. It's more complicated, because not everything can be set aside so easily. Memories linger, not in dramatic flashes, but in quiet moments, in the way a long silence feels, in how waiting now carries a different weight. And these things don't always have clear solutions. They simply exist. Now let's gently widen the view one last time. Because the story of prisoners of war doesn't end with individual returns. It also changes how the world thinks about war itself. Each conflict, each experience, adds something to a growing understanding. That captivity is not just a side effect of war. It's a central part of it, and how it is handled matters. Over time, rules become more detailed, more specific. Attempts are made to ensure that what happened in one war does not happen again in the next. And while these efforts are not always perfect, they represent something important, an acknowledgement that even in conflict there are limits, or at least there should be. Now, as we come to the end of this quiet journey, it's worth returning to where we began, that moment after the battle. The silence, the uncertainty, the realization that surviving the fight was only the beginning, because what followed was a different kind of experience, less visible, less talked about, but just as defining. The life of a prisoner of war was not one single story. It was many stories, some brief, some long, some marked by small moments of kindness, others shaped by long stretches of waiting. But all of them shared that same quiet thread, the feeling of being in between conflict and peace, between capture and freedom, between who you were and who you would become after. And perhaps that's the part that lingers the most. Not the camps themselves, not the systems, but that sense of transition, of being held in a moment that stretches longer than expected. So as you settle back into your own space, your own time, just notice how different it feels to be somewhere familiar, to not be waiting for permission to move forward, and let that thought sit quietly for a moment. Because tonight, we didn't follow heroes or victories. We followed something quieter, the people who lost and lived, and what happened to them after the world stopped fighting. Now, you can let the story drift away, slowly, just like everything else tonight. The first thing to understand about medieval warfare is that it had absolutely no interest in your childhood. None at all. Childhood, in fact, was more of a suggestion than a protected phase of life. A brief, fragile window where you might play in the dirt before someone hands you a knife and tells you to stand near a battlefield and try not to die in a particularly embarrassing way. And so, naturally, there were children. Quite a lot of them, actually. Not leading grand charges on horseback that was reserved for grown men with questionable decision-making skills, but lingering just behind the chaos, carrying things, watching things, learning slowly how violence works. Because if you were born into the wrong place, or perhaps the right place, depending on how your family saw it, war was not distant. It was not a story. It was a trade. And trades, like baking or blacksmithing, were best learned young. So let's begin with a boy. Not a specific boy, just a very typical one. He is maybe 8 or 9. No one is entirely sure. Birth records are not exactly a priority when your village measures time by harvests and unfortunate raids. His clothes do not fit properly. And today, for reasons that feel both very important and not important at all, he is being taken along with the army. Not as a soldier, of course. That would be ridiculous. He is far too small to hold a spear properly. Instead, he is a page, or a runner, or a helper. The titles shift, but the reality is the same. He carries water. He sharpens blades badly at first. He watches older men argue about strategy in ways that sound very confident and are occasionally correct. And most importantly, he learns, not through lessons, not through books, but through proximity, which, as it turns out, is a very effective teacher. Now, if this boy happens to be born into a noble family, things take on a more polished tone. He might be sent to another lord's household as a page, where he will serve meals, polish armor, and try very hard not to trip. This is considered training. He will learn how to bow correctly, how to speak without sounding like a complete fool, and eventually, how to handle weapons that are, at this stage, still slightly too large for him. There's a quiet assumption here. No one says it out loud, because that would be impolite. But the assumption is that one day, this child will fight. So he watches tournaments, he watches drills, he watches grown men hit each other with alarming enthusiasm. And slowly, he begins to imitate them. Wooden swords at first, clumsy swings, a lot of falling over. But improvement comes quickly when your alternative is being considered useless. By the time he reaches his early teens, he might become a squire. Which sounds impressive, and in some ways it is. He now serves a knight directly. He helps him dress for battle. He carries his shield. He stands nearby during fights, trying to look helpful and not terrified. And sometimes he is pulled in, not officially, not ceremonially, just gradually. A gap opens in the line. Someone shouts. Someone points. And suddenly the boy with the not quite fitting armor is holding a weapon. He is doing his best impression of a person who understands what is happening. Which, to be fair, he does not. But that has never stopped anyone. Now for children who were not born into nobility, things are simpler, not easier. Just simpler. There are no formal titles, no elegant training systems, no careful progression. There is just need. Armies require a lot of support. Food must be carried. Weapons must be moved. Messages must be delivered quickly through unsafe areas. And children, inconveniently small and surprisingly fast, are very good at this. So they are used. A boy might run between units with orders. A girl might help tend to the wounded, fetching water, trying not to look too closely at things. Some children attach themselves to soldiers. Not officially adopted, but tolerated. They follow the camp and sleep near the fires. They learn which men are kind, which ones are not, and how to stay just useful enough to avoid being sent away. Or worse, ignored entirely. Because invisibility in a medieval army is a dangerous thing. Now it's tempting to imagine these children as constantly terrified. And yes, fear is certainly there. But there is also adaptation. Humans get used to things they probably shouldn't. The sounds of a camp, the clatter of armor, the murmur of voices, the occasional distant scream become background noise. The sight of injury becomes something you glance at, then look away from, then eventually stop noticing altogether. There is work to be done. Let's drift, gently, to another scene. A siege. Medieval warfare loved a good siege. It's slow, uncomfortable, and filled with long stretches of waiting. Inside the walls, there are children. Outside the walls, there are also children. Inside, they carry stones to reinforce barricades. They help ration food, learning very quickly that hunger is a long-term companion. They watch their parents grow thinner. They hear arguments about whether help will come, or whether surrender is a better option. And outside, in the encampments, other children fetch water, gather firewood, and assist in the construction of siege engines. They hand tools to men who are building something that will eventually be used to break the walls where other children are waiting. There is a kind of quiet symmetry. Both sides are using what they have, and what they have includes the young. Now occasionally, a child becomes something more than just a helper. This is not a story about child heroes charging into battle. Still, there are moments. A boy who holds a position. A young squire who stays with his knight. A messenger who makes it through. These moments are noticed. But they are also absorbed into the larger narrative, where individual stories blur into a general sense of things. And so the child who did something remarkable becomes, over time, just another soldier who started young. They grow. The small hands that once struggled to lift a sword become steady. The unsure steps become confident. And one day, without any clear moment of transition, they are no longer children in an army. They are just soldiers. Not all child soldiers were attached to formal armies. Some existed on the edges. These were the children of raids. Taken young, they might be absorbed into new communities, raised among those who were once enemies, taught new languages and customs. A boy might grow up to fight for the group that captured him, not out of loyalty, but out of familiarity. This is now his world. Identity is flexible when survival depends on it. Across medieval landscapes, children moved through war as expected participants, always present, always learning, always becoming part of the machinery. And the machinery had no intention of stopping. As the campfires dim, we can notice a pattern. Once a child enters this world, it is very difficult to leave it behind. The habits formed here, the alertness, the adaptability, tend to linger. Even in moments of peace, there are adults who learned early how to exist in conflict. Picture the boy again. The one with the rough hands and the too large tunic. He's older now. Not by much, but enough. He knows where to stand. He knows when to move. He knows how to survive. Tomorrow, he will wake up and continue along a path that was never a choice. Because in medieval times, choice is a luxury. And childhood is just the beginning of learning how to do without it. If part 1 felt like being ushered into a medieval war camp and told, just stand there and don't touch anything sharp, then part 2 is where someone gently places a very sharp object in your hands and expects you to figure it out. Because once a child was inside this world, the next logical step was obvious to everyone involved. Make them useful. Not in a cruel, dramatic sense. This was much quieter. A steady shaping of behavior until the child fit neatly into the needs of the group. Usefulness, in medieval terms, was a kind of safety. If you could carry something, you were kept. If you could learn, you were valued. If you could be trusted not to panic at the wrong moment, you might even be respected. And so training began with repetition. A noble-born boy, now settling into his role as a page, wakes early. He always wakes early because someone else outranks him. He dresses quickly in clothes that are still slightly too big, and begins his day with tasks that sound simple and are, in fact, not. Polishing armor is less about making it shine and more about understanding it, where it bends, where it breaks, where it needs reinforcement. Without realizing it, the boy is learning how a body is protected and, by extension, how it might be vulnerable. Then there is the matter of weapons. At first, he is not trusted with anything dangerous. Instead, he practices with wooden versions, swords that feel too light, spears that wobble, shields that are more suggestion than defense. He swings, he misses. He swings again. There is a rhythm to it. A slow, repetitive motion that builds familiarity. No one expects him to be good immediately. But improvement is expected, and he does improve. Because children are very good at learning through imitation. He watches the knights, the way they stand. Posture, in this world, is everything. Confidence is not optional. It is performed, even when it isn't entirely felt. Now let's slide away from nobility and back into the chaotic world of common soldiers, where training is less about form and more about function. Here, A child learns by doing. There are no wooden swords. If you are handed something, it is because someone expects you to use it. He learns how to tie knots that won't slip, how to pack equipment so it can be moved quickly, how to listen for instructions. Perhaps most importantly, how to anticipate needs before they are spoken. If a soldier reaches for something and it's already there, the child becomes noticeable. Not all training is physical. Children learn very quickly who holds power, who gets listened to, who you absolutely do not interrupt. So the child adapts. They speak less. They observe more. They learn when to step forward and when to quietly disappear. Let's drift to a training yard, worn smooth by years of practice. Here, young squires are put through drills, mounting and dismounting a horse, handling a lance, learning how to keep it steady, how to aim, not with precision, but with intent. And then there are the sparring sessions. Consistency is the real goal here, not brilliance. While all this is happening, there is something else quietly shaping these children: expectation. A noble child is expected to lead. A common child is expected to support, endure, persist. These expectations are absorbed, not questioned. Emotional control. This is not taught explicitly. It is modeled. Adults in these environments display a certain restraint. Children learn to keep things contained. Fear is acknowledged, but not indulged. Loss is noted, and then set aside. Let's drift to a marching column, an army on the move. Among the soldiers, there are children, walking, carrying, keeping pace. Occasionally, there is kindness. A soldier might share food with a child who looks worn out. A knight might offer a word of encouragement. These moments are not grand, but they matter. They introduce connection. And connection has a way of softening the edges of a harsh environment. Children in medieval warfare were shaped, guided, molded into roles that the world needed filled. Not always gently, but consistently. In the next part, we'll explore when training turns into participation, and the line between child and soldier becomes increasingly difficult to see. There isn't a clear moment when a child in a medieval army becomes something else. No ceremony, no official announcement. No one gathers around and says, "Congratulations, you are now a participant in actual danger." It just happens, gradually, almost politely. One day, a boy is carrying a shield behind his knight, watching carefully, trying not to trip over uneven ground. The next, that same shield is in his hands for a different reason. Not to hold, not to admire, but to use. And no one makes a big deal out of it. Because from the perspective of everyone else, this was always going to happen. Let's return briefly to that training yard we left behind. It's empty now. Quiet, the dust is settled. The wooden swords are stacked neatly. But outside those walls, the real world is less organized. A skirmish, perhaps. Just a brief clash between groups with very limited patience. And somewhere within this, there is a young squire. He is not at the front, but he is close enough to hear the sounds clearly. The sharp, irregular rhythm of movement, the shouts, the metallic noises that, in training, were controlled, but here are anything but. He stays where he was told to stay, at first. Because instructions, up to this point, have been very important. But then something shifts. A moment brief, confusing, where doing nothing feels incorrect. And so he steps forward. Just a small adjustment, until he is no longer quite where he started. Now what happens next is not a story of heroism. Instead, it is small decisions. He moves when others move, because standing still seems like a poor choice. And for a few moments, he is part of it, participating. And then, just as quietly as it began, it ends. The skirmish breaks apart, the noise fades. The world returns to its previous state. Now let's drift to another setting, a siege again. This time we're outside the walls. The army has settled in. Tents are arranged, a young messenger perhaps. At first, his routes are simple, short distances, safe paths. But over time, those routes become more complex. He begins to understand the landscape not just as a place, but as a series of risks. And one day, he is sent somewhere different. He hesitates, briefly, but then he goes. Because this is what he does. And in that moment, he's a participant in conflict. Consider another path. A camp follower. A child who has grown up alongside an army, learning its rhythms and its unspoken rules. They know how to move without drawing attention. They move quietly, carefully, from helper to something closer to scout. Functionally, yes. Many of these stories end in ways that are deeply unfortunate. But medieval records are not interested in those outcomes. They focus on broader events. There's a gap in the narrative where many lives existed, briefly intersected with history, and then faded. After the fighting, children are involved in less visible ways. They help gather equipment. They assist in tending to the wounded. They learn what remains when the action is over. This knowledge stays with them. It is not something that can be easily set aside. No one stops and says, perhaps this is not ideal. War is normal. Children are part of society, therefore. Children are part of war. The boy who found himself in that unmarked transition continues on. He is simply included. And over time, that inclusion becomes identity. He is no longer a child near an army. He is part of it. The question now is, how far will that involvement go? As the evening settles, we leave our young not-quite soldier in a place that feels familiar. Not safe, but known. Next, we'll see how deep this path extends into the rare moments when children were fully, unmistakably embedded in the heart of conflict itself. By the time we reach this point, it almost feels unnecessary to ask whether children belonged in medieval warfare. They did, not as a dramatic exception. Not as a rare tragedy that shocked everyone involved. Just as part of the landscape. And that, perhaps, is the quietest and most unsettling part of all. Because once something becomes normal, it stops being questioned. It simply continues. So let's follow that continuation, gently, as it stretches into the later stages of these young lives. The boy we've been drifting alongside is older now. Not in a way that feels sudden or transformative. There was no clear turning point. No moment where he woke up and thought, ah yes, I am no longer a child. Instead, it happened the way most things have happened for him, gradually, almost unnoticed. His hands are steadier now. His movements more efficient. The tasks that once required effort are now done without much thought at all. He no longer needs to be told where to stand. He already knows. And perhaps more importantly, others know that he knows, which changes things. He is trusted with slightly more responsibility, nothing grand. Nothing that would be written down or remembered. But enough to mark a shift. He might be placed closer to the front during a movement. He might be asked to carry something more important. He might even be given a direct instruction that implies confidence. And confidence, in this world, is a kind of currency. Now let's be clear. This does not mean he has become a great warrior. He is still young, still learning. Still, in many ways, vulnerable. But he is no longer separate. And that separation, once gone, rarely returns. Let's drift for a moment into a different setting. Not a battlefield. Just a quiet stretch of land after a campaign has ended. The army is dispersing. Some soldiers return home. Others move on, following new opportunities, or simply the next place where their skills might be needed. And among them are those who started young. Former pages, former runners. Former children who grew up in the shadow of war. For some, this transition is almost seamless. They were always heading here, always moving toward this role. So when they finally stand among the soldiers as equals, it feels less like a change and more like a continuation. But for others, it's less clear. Because while the environment shaped them, it did not erase everything. There are still traces of something else. Something quieter. Something that belonged to a time before the routines and the steady rhythm of conflict. And occasionally, in moments of stillness, that something surfaces. not dramatically. Just a passing thought, a brief sense that life could have been different. And then it fades, because there is work to be done. There are places to go. And the present, as always, demands attention. Now let's consider those who do not remain within the world of warfare. Because not every child who enters the system stays in it forever. Some leave. Not through a grand decision, but through circumstance. A campaign ends, and the structures that once held everything together begin to loosen. Back in a village, perhaps. Or in a town that feels unfamiliar despite being technically home. And this is where things become complicated. Because the skills learned in war do not always translate neatly into everyday life. Knowing how to read a camp is not like navigating a market. Understanding the rhythm of a march does not quite prepare you for the slower pace of farming or trade. And so there is an adjustment. Some manage it. They take what they've learned in discipline, awareness, endurance, and apply it to new tasks. They become reliable workers, but others find it harder. Because once you've lived where danger is constant, the slower rhythms of ordinary life can feel distant, less urgent. So some drift back toward what they know. Guard work, mercenary groups. Traveling with those who expect toughness and familiarity with risk. The medieval world did not have a concept of child soldier. They were simply young people doing what was required of them. Across regions, across centuries, the presence of children in warfare remains consistent. The core idea integration into conflict persists, quietly, steadily, almost without comment. That persistence tells us something important about the nature of societies under pressure. When resources are limited, when survival is uncertain, the boundaries we might expect between child and adult begin to blur. Now, as we ease toward the end of this drift, let's return to the image we started with. A child, standing at the edge of something vast. At first, they are uncertain. Then, slowly, they step forward. They take on tasks. They absorb expectations. They become useful. And eventually, without any clear boundary marking the change, they become part of the system itself, carried along by a world that rarely pauses. Childhood for many was not something separate. It was the beginning of learning how to exist within it. The fires burn low, the camps grow quiet. And somewhere, in the dim space between rest and work, another young person settles into sleep, accustomed. And in that quiet acceptance, the story, in its own understated way, comes to an end. The easiest way to understand what it was like to be a knight squire is to imagine having a very important job that nobody respects until you stop doing it. Because that, in many ways, was the entire role. You were essential. You were necessary. You were absolutely not the main character. So let's begin gently with a boy, not a legendary one. Not the future of a kingdom. Just a fairly standard medieval child who happened to be born into a family with enough status to aim slightly higher than farm forever. He's about 7 when things start to change. Which by modern standards, feels like an age where you should be worrying about losing shoes. But in medieval Europe, 7 was considered a perfectly reasonable time to begin preparing for a life of controlled chaos. So off he goes. Not to war. Not yet. That would be premature. Instead, he is sent to another lord's household. This is important. Being a squire, or more accurately, a page, is not something you do at home. You are handed over to someone else to be shaped. Think of it as a long-term internship, with armor, and a slightly higher risk of accidental injury. When he arrives at this new household, nothing about him is particularly impressive. He is small, he is uncertain. He is trying very hard not to trip over his own feet while bowing to people who expect him to already understand how to bow properly. But that's fine. Because the first lesson of being a future squire is simple. Observe everything. He watches how the servants move. He watches how the knights carry themselves. He watches how conversations happen, who speaks first, who interrupts, who absolutely never gets interrupted. and slowly, he begins to mimic. Not perfectly, but enough. Now his daily routine is not glamorous. He wakes early, always early. The kind of early where the sun is still deciding whether it wants to participate in the day. He dresses quickly, usually with some assistance at first, because buttons and laces have a way of becoming unexpectedly complicated. And then the tasks begin. Carrying things is a big one. Trays, buckets, small items that somehow become heavy over time. He learns very quickly that just carry this can mean anything from a light inconvenience to a slow test of endurance. And then there is cleaning. Armor does not clean itself, which is unfortunate, because armor is heavy and enthusiastic about collecting dirt. So the boy polishes, and scrubs, and polishes again. At first he does it poorly. There are streaks, missed spots. And this is noticed, not with anger, not usually, but with a quiet correction. Again, and so he does it again. Because repetition, as we've already begun to suspect, is the backbone of medieval training. Now somewhere in all of this, there's also education. Not in the modern sense. No classrooms, no neat rows of desks, but he learns. He learns how to read. He learns basic arithmetic. He learns prayers, because religion is everywhere. And he learns manners. This might be the most important part, because a knight is not just someone who fights. He is someone who represents a certain ideal. So the boy learns how to speak politely, how to serve food without spilling it, how to stand in a room full of important people. And then gradually something shifts. He grows. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that the adults see potential. And this is when the transition begins. He is no longer just a page. He is becoming a squire. Now, the title sounds impressive, but in practice, it means one thing above all else. You now belong to a knight. You are assigned to him. You assist him. You learn from him. And perhaps most importantly, you follow him everywhere. Which brings us to the less comfortable part. Knights spend a lot of time preparing for violence, so the squire begins to see more. He helps his knight put on armor. This is a surprisingly complex process. There are straps, layers, pieces that must fit together. At first he fumbles. He hands things in the wrong order. He tightens something too much. He forgets a step entirely. Until one day, he does it smoothly, efficiently, without being told, and his knight notices. Not with applause, but with a small nod. Beyond armor, there are weapons. The squire is now allowed to handle real ones. He learns how to maintain them, how to keep them sharp. Training becomes more serious. Now there is weight, balance. He practices with other squires. They spar, they circle. Now let's talk about horses. Knights and horses are a package deal. And horses are large. They have opinions. The squire learns to ride. At first, it is awkward. He bounces. He grips too tightly. But again, repetition works its quiet magic. He rides again and again, until the movement becomes familiar. Until the horse feels like an extension of his own balance. The knight is not always a warm mentor, but he is there. He observes. He corrects. Occasionally, in quieter moments, he explains. Waiting. There is a lot of waiting. Knights do not spend every moment in action. During these times, the squire waits. He stands nearby, knowing when to act is important. But knowing when not to act is equally valuable, so he learns to be still, to be ready. Occasionally, there are moments of mild chaos. A tournament, perhaps. These are displays of skill. And the squire is right there. He helps prepare his knight. He manages equipment. He stays alert for anything that might go wrong. And things do go wrong. In these moments, the squire learns how to respond. Quickly, calmly, without drawing unnecessary attention. Because in the world of knights, competence is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply functions. The training continues and the days blend together. It is not glamorous. It is not heroic. It is preparation. There's a very specific distance a squire is expected to maintain from danger. Not too far, because then he is useless. Not too close, because then he becomes a problem. It is a delicate balance, and no one ever really explains it in clear terms. A campaign has begun. Just a steady movement of men, horses, and equipment. The squire travels with his knight. He eats when he can. He rests when he's allowed. He stays alert, because missing an instruction is not ideal. At some point, the army arrives somewhere that matters. Everything changes slightly. The general sense of traveling shifts into "we are here." Armor must be prepared. Weapons must be checked. There is no time for hesitation, so the squire moves quickly. The squire does not charge forward with the knight. Instead, he stays just behind, close enough to respond. Far enough to avoid involvement. The knight needs something. A quick fix to something no longer right, and the squire moves. Without thinking too much about it, he sees more, hears more, understands in an immediate way what all that training has been quietly preparing him for. The experience has settled in. Another piece of understanding added to the collection. Now let's talk about mistakes. A squire might hand the wrong item at the wrong time. He might misjudge a situation, and the consequences are educational. The squire is nearing the point where his training is almost complete. He can handle equipment without thinking. He understands the rhythm of this life, the balance between presence and distance, the quiet, steady demand to be useful at all times. A gradual shift from squire to something else. For now, we leave him here, standing just close enough to matter. At some point, and no one really agrees on the exact timing, the squire stops being in training and starts being expected. Not officially. There isn't a grand announcement. No one gathers in a hall and says, "Well done, you've completed the program." Instead, it happens in the same way everything else has happened so far. Gradually, without ceremony. With a quiet shift in how people treat him. He is given more responsibility, but not in a way that feels new. More like the natural extension of what he has already been doing. Take care of this, handle that. You know what to do. And he does, because by now he really does. Let's ease into one of these moments. The knight he serves is preparing again. Another campaign. Another movement toward a place where disagreement is about to become very physical. But this time, something is slightly different. The knight does less explaining. Not out of indifference, but out of confidence. He assumes the squire understands. So the squire organizes the equipment almost entirely on his own. He checks the straps, inspects the weapons, ensures the horse is ready, all without needing constant oversight. And when the knight arrives, everything is correct. No adjustments needed. No quiet corrections. Just a brief glance, and perhaps the smallest hint of approval. Which by now, the squire recognizes as a very big deal. Now let's talk about something that has been quietly building in the background. Independence. Up until this point, the squire has always operated in close proximity to his knight. Following, assisting, responding. But now, there are moments where he is sent off on his own. Small tasks at first. Take this message. Check on that group. See if everything is ready. Simple enough. But they require him to act without immediate supervision. To make decisions, however minor, on his own. And he does. Carefully. Thoughtfully. With just enough confidence to avoid hesitation. But not so much that he becomes careless. And this balance is important, because too much confidence, in this world, has a way of correcting itself very quickly. Now, as the campaign progresses, the squire finds himself closer and closer to the center of things. Not intentionally, not as a goal, just as a result of being useful. If something needs to be done quickly, he is sent. If something requires attention, he handles it. And occasionally, this places him in situations that feel familiar, but slightly more intense than before. A clash begins. Not large, not overwhelming, but enough. The knight moves forward, as expected. And the squire follows. Not because he was told to, but because that is the rhythm he has learned. He stays just behind as always. But now, when something goes wrong, a strap loosens, a weapon shifts, a moment of imbalance, he steps in without hesitation. He fixes it, adjusts, responds, and then, instead of stepping back immediately, he remains, not out of bravery, not out of recklessness, just because it feels normal. And this is where the line fades almost completely. Because what he is doing now is not fundamentally different from what a soldier does. He is present. He is responsive. He is part of the movement. The only difference is expectation. No one expects him to lead. No one expects him to take initiative beyond his role. But within that role, he functions fully. Now let's drift to a quieter moment. The aftermath of a long day. The camp has settled. The noise has softened into that familiar background hum of voices, movement, and the occasional horse reminding everyone that it exists. The squire sits, perhaps near a small fire, going through equipment, checking, cleaning, maintaining. These tasks have not changed, but he has. There is less uncertainty in his movements, less hesitation in his decisions. He no longer needs to think about each step. He simply does. And in that quiet, repetitive work, there's a kind of reflection, not in words, not in clear thoughts, just a subtle awareness that he is no longer where he started. He remembers vaguely what it felt like to be unsure, to watch and not understand, to imitate without knowing why. And now, he understands, not everything, of course not. Medieval life does not come with a full instruction manual, but enough. Enough to function, enough to contribute, enough to be trusted. Now let's consider the idea of recognition, because eventually, there comes a point where others begin to see the squire differently. Not as a trainee, not as someone who is still learning the basics, but as someone who can be relied upon. A fellow squire might ask him for advice. A soldier might trust him with a task without questioning it. Even his knight might begin to treat him less like a subordinate and more like an assistant. It's subtle, no one announces it, but it's there, and it matters. Because recognition in this world is not given lightly. It is earned, slowly, quietly, and once it is given, it changes the way you move through the world. Now let's ease into one of the final steps. The moment when the idea of becoming a knight is no longer hypothetical. It's approaching. Not today. Not tomorrow, but soon. The squire knows this. Not because someone has told him directly, but because the signs are there. He is given more responsibility, more independence, more trust. And with that comes a shift in expectation. He's no longer just preparing. He is almost ready. Now it's important to note that becoming a knight is not guaranteed. Not every squire reaches that point. Circumstance, skill, opportunity, all of these play a role. But for those who do, the transition is, once again, surprisingly understated. A ceremony, perhaps. A formal acknowledgement. But nothing that feels as long or as detailed as the years of preparation that came before. Because the real transformation has already happened. In the early mornings, in the repetitive tasks, in the quiet corrections and small moments of approval. That is where the squire became something more. Now as we begin to settle this part, we can see the full arc more clearly. The boy who arrived uncertain, carrying trays and polishing armor, has become someone who can stand in the middle of a campaign and function without guidance. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but effectively. And that, in this world, is enough. In the next part, we'll drift into what happens after. Not the grand life of a knight in shining armor, because reality tends to be less polished than that. But the continuation of this path, the responsibilities, the expectations, the quiet realization that becoming a knight is not the end of the journey, just a slightly more demanding version of it. But for now, we leave him here, on the edge of something new. Not stepping into it with dramatic confidence, but easing forward, one small steady step at a time. By the time a squire reaches the point where people start quietly thinking, yes, he'll do, the actual transition to knighthood feels almost anticlimactic, which is slightly unfair, considering the years of effort that came before it. But medieval life has a habit of doing that. Big moments arrive quietly. Important changes happen without much announcement. So let's ease into it. The squire has reached that stage where his presence feels natural in any situation the knight might enter. He knows how to prepare. He knows how to respond. He knows how to exist within the rhythm of this life without needing constant direction. And so one day, the question is no longer, is he learning? It becomes, is he ready? Now, readiness in this context is not a perfectly defined thing. There's no checklist. Instead, it is a general sense. A collection of observations made over time. He handles responsibility well. He does not panic easily. He makes fewer mistakes than he used to, and when he does make them, he corrects them quickly. And perhaps most importantly, he is reliable. Reliability in a world built on uncertainty is a very valuable trait. So the decision is made, not dramatically, just decided.